Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we'll be looking at the response object and all the different ways that we can send data back to the client in the response object. First of all, here's a quick recap of what we did in the last lesson. We went over the different ways that we can utilize data from the request object. We used parameters by changing the route pattern itself. We used query parameters, which we were able to send using Thunder Client and access using rec.query and then the name of the parameter. And then we also looked at the request body, which is sent in JSON form, usually in a post or put request. And lastly, we looked at request headers, which are used to send sensitive information or additional information about the request. The three major ways we can utilize the response object to send responses back to the client are firstly plain text, and secondly JSON form, and thirdly we can also add status codes to both of the above. So far, wherever we've been using the res.send method, we've been sending plain text. So that's the first bullet point that we've already covered. We've just been sending plain text, and we've seen how this actually looks in Thunder Client. When we send a response back, this is how it looks like. It's just plain text, right? Now, the second thing we were going to discuss is sending the response back in JSON format. Now, sending plain text is all right when we have to send a very simple message. However, what if we have to send a complex object? Like, for example, when we're searching for objects, suppose we've searched for a certain name of an item and a maximum price. We would want to return an array of all the objects which match this criteria. In this case, we might have to send an array, or in another case, we might have to send one particular item that was requested by the user, in which case we'd have to return its price, maybe its description, its name, and other information about it. In this case, a simple text message would not suffice. We would need to send a JSON object. And we actually have a method for that, and I'm just going to show you how that works. So typically, we would fetch this item from a database, and we're going to delve into that very soon. But for now, let's just create a simple JavaScript object and see how we can use res.json to send it back to the client. So I'm just going to create an object right here. And let's suppose this item has, for example, a name. And let's give it the name property of, for example, laptop. And let's say it has a price, and that is, let's say it's $200. And it has a description. And maybe we have some description in here. Now, if I want to send all of this information, tell that, the first string is going to be the name, the next one is the price, the next one is the description. We would need to actually send this whole thing back as an object, right? So in this case, we wouldn't use a string. We would actually use res.json, and then we can just send the item like this. So now if we go open to Thunder Client and we get you access the same endpoint. Let's make sure our server is running first. All right, our server is running. Let's send this request. And there's some issue. Let's see what the problem is. Okay, that's items, not item. I made a typo here. Send again, and here. So now we actually have the response in JSON format. So it's not exactly, as you can see, it's not a JavaScript object like we can see here. It's actually in JSON format. And what res.json does is that essentially it converts the JavaScript object to JSON format and handles that conversion for us. And this is very useful, and this is actually going to be our standard because we're dealing with structured data throughout this course. So we're going to be dealing with structured and nested data from our database. So we should be using res.json as much as we can. Even if we have to send a simple message, like for example, got your request, for example, or got the item, we should be sending it in JSON format. We can do it in something like this. So we can just change this to res.json, and then let's make a simple JavaScript object right here inside this function. And we can just write message. So you can give it a message property, and that can be equal to got your request. Now, this is the standard that we would want to follow in general. So when we get our, when we send it to this endpoint, which is search, we're sending search, right? Let's maybe not send any query parameters for now. Move this. Okay, we don't have any query parameters for now. And we can see, okay, sorry, I forgot to refresh the server because we made some changes. We must refresh our server. This is what it looked like before when we had plain text, and now if you run the server again, our changes will be reflected, and now we have a JSON object with the message property. And this will be useful because in case of error, we might not be sending a message. Maybe we're sending an error message instead, or some different information. So we should be using structured data. We should be using JSON to handle our responses. And this is going to be the good practice for us because we're not dealing with very simple data. Now, the last thing we'll discuss today are status codes. Status codes are a very important part of the HTTP protocol because they allow us to know what, if any error occurred during the process of the API endpoint, and if so, what the error was. Now, we haven't been using status codes so far in our responses, which isn't a good practice. Let's fix that. So, for example, over here, we just have one simple response being sent. So for example, we could have a status added right here. So we're going to write dot status and then let's send 200. So this means 200 means the default status, which is a success, right? And status codes are in the range from 100 to over 500, and they all have specific standardized meanings. 200, for example, means a successful response, right? And all the status codes between 200 up to 299 are going to be success codes. Similarly, if we run into an error, we would want to return a response with the appropriate error code. For example, in this case, we're only responding with one JSON message, right? And that has got your request. But in case the item name was not provided, maybe we want to send back an error message. So let's go ahead and do some error handling here. Let's move this up here. And if the item name was provided, we could maybe respond with thanks. You provided the item name. Because the console logs obviously are not visible to the user, they're going to be on the server side. We can just remove these so that we can actually send this response back to the client. And if no item name was provided, we are going to respond with a similar message, but this time we're going to say that, maybe, oops, you didn't provide the item name. And again, we're going to be looking at this item name inside the query parameters, of course, right? Okay, now, when we're sending the message over here, we would want to add a success status. So let's add status 200. And in this case, we would send an error status. And that would be something like status 400. And now let's go ahead into let's first of all restart our server so that we can reflect the new changes. And then we're going to go ahead and go into our search. In the queue parameters, we can let's just leave it without any parameters because we're putting the check on the item name for now. Let's click on send, and as you can see here, the status has been returned as 400 bad request, which means that something has been wrong with our request. Similarly, if we go ahead here and add the item name and then we send the request, you can see that the status has actually changed to reflect what our server status is, which means that it is saying that it's all right, and the response and the request is in the correct format. So as you can see, this is going to be really useful to us in the future. We should get acquainted with how to use JSON responses and how to use status codes because this is the best practice in API programming. If you're interested in learning more about status codes, I would really recommend to read these MDN talks. You don't have to read and memorize every single status code, but it's really going to help you understand, for example, if the successful responses are between 200 to 299, what kind of different ones can there be? And this is pretty interesting to just go through once just to look at what kind of responses we can have and how status codes actually work. Now, before we end this lesson, there's two things I want to talk about. The first thing is what happens when we actually forget to add a response or don't send any response at all. Let's comment this out and then test it. Let's go over into our Thunder client, make sure our server is running, and let's send this request. And you can see this just keeps getting stuck on a processing screen, which means that it's just going to keep waiting until the response is sent back from the server. So make sure that whenever you're making any endpoint, always include a response. This is very important because otherwise your request will be left hanging like this. The second thing that I wanted to talk about is what if we send two responses by accident? Look, for example, over here, we had sent the response here and we had sent the response here as well. What if, in case neither of these conditions is true, we want to send a different response? Like, for example, let's have another error message here, and we can send a JSON format. And now the message would be maybe something went wrong. All right, what would happen in this case? Let's run our server again to reflect these changes. And let's send a request to search. Let's see what happens. Now that we haven't included any query parameters, I might be expecting that this is what I should get. I should get, oops, you didn't provide the item name, right? Let's send this and see what happens. You can see that it has actually thrown a pretty big error up here in the console. And it says it cannot set the headers after they're sent to the client, which means that over here it thinks that it already has to send this response back to the client, but over here it's getting a different response. So in this case, when you have multiple different kinds of statuses being returned, it's always a good idea to write return next to the statement, which means the function will end right here. I'm just going to add return everywhere here. This means that if it comes to this point of the code, it's going to return the function right here after sending this response, and it's not going to continue. And typically, this is what we mean whenever we write res.send or res.json. We're trying to say that this is where the API endpoints entire flow is just going to end here, and we're going to send a response back to the client. So always remember that if you have multiple responses, it's always a good idea to put the response at the very end, or always write return next to your response. Let's try that again and see what happens. Run our server again. Actually, it's getting quite messy. Let me just type in clear this terminal, and then we can run our server again. And let's see what happens now. Now you can see that we didn't get any error message because we added those return statements right here. That is all for today. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for the next video in which we'll actually be connecting to our Mongo database and processing data by adding stuff to it, removing stuff from it, and searching inside our database. So stay tuned and happy coding.